Today's shiur begins at the Mishnah that you'll find 7 lines from the top of Daf Kuf Dalid. Before we begin the Mishnah, we glance at the side under our our topic heading, where we've written Chalitza Balayla, Machloikes Tanoim. Can Chalitza be done at night? This will be a Machlokes Tanoim, a controversy between different Tanaic authorities. Our Mishnah. Cholza Balayla, Chalitza Kshera. If Chalitza were done at night, according to the Tanakama, the first opinion, that's acceptable. It's valid. For Rebbe Elazar Posel, he says it's unacceptable. Bismoil Chalitza Psula, removal of the shoe from the brother-in-law's left foot is invalid. Rebbe Elazar Machshir. And here you see a switch in terms of opinions of the Tanakama and Rebbe Ozer, whereas in the first issue concerning nighttime, the Tanakama was Mekil, and regarding left, you see the Tanakama is Machmir. Leimo beho komifli. Can we suggest that the machlokis regarding nighttime is in the following? The mor sovar makshinon rivim lenegoyim, that we compare the approach taken to rivim. Rivim, translated would mean arguments, controversies, is to be compared to negoyim, to rules that govern torahs. The pasuk in fact says kol riv v'chol nega, and we know that negoyim, skin afflictions, etc. There's skin affliction, there's fabric affliction, and there's house affliction. We know that the matter is dealt with in order to determine whether a discoloration is truly a sign of tsaras through a Kohen viewing the discoloration by day. The pasuk says, and Rashi quotes it, "Uvayom he'ra'os boy." That means by daytime. So if we suggest that if we do compare rivim to negoyim, then I'm going to be telling you that rivim, matters of controversy, of din, money matters, court cases involving monetary issues, that's rivim, also is limited to day. Now Rashi adds that chalitza comes into the realm of din because there's an issue of collecting the ksuba, the financial guarantees due to a woman when she becomes a widow. So the issue of ksuba is connected to the issue of chalitza, which is in the realm of rivim, court cases involving monetary matters. So Rebbe Ozer would seem, who says that chalitza at night is invalid, it's because he applies to rivim, which includes chalitza, the standard that we apply to negoyim. Umor savar, the Tanakama, who says nighttime chalitza is okay, lo makshinon rivim lenegoyim, he doesn't make that comparison. The Gemara's response to this suggestion is lo, that's not the point of controversy. The kuli almo lo makshinon rivim lenegoyim. Everyone will agree that we don't compare rivim to negoyim. The makshinon, if we were to compare, then afilu gemar din balaylo namilo. Then even the end of a court case involving monetary matters, which we called rivim, would not be able to take place at night. And that's not the case. We know that the starting of cases is in fact done by day, but the conclusion of monetary matters can take place at night. So that you see that there is the topic of rivim is not really compared to negoyim. Negoyim, there's no aspect of negoyim, of viewing negoyim, that can take place at night. Whereas in the case of monetary matters, the gemar din, the final ruling, the conclusion of the case, as long as it's started by day, can take place at night. So if that's not the point of controversy, then what is? The following will be their point of controversy. Mor savar chalitza ketchilas din damya. Rebbe Ozer, who requires daytime, he views chalitza as the beginning of the case. Umor sover chalitza kigmar din dami. The Tanakama, who accepts nighttime, is viewing chalitza as the conclusion of the din. And we mentioned before that conclusion of cases can take place at night. Rabo Barchia Katisfa Ovad Uvda B'mok Ubiyachidi Ubalayla. 3 points that are worth noting, and that is that Rabba did a chalitza using a mok. Now the mok is a type of footgear, but it's not leather. We have seen mok referred to in our previous shiurim. Also biyachidi. That means that he was the only one that was present when the chalitza was done, and he did it at night. Omar Shmuel, Kama Rav Guvrei David Ki Echida. Rav Guvrei literally means how great a man he is, but in this context, Rashi says Shmuel is saying this sarcastically. How great does he think he is that he can rule, and he can paskin, he can rule according to the opinion of a minority opinion. A Yechidah means a singular authority. In other words, when we deal with the rules of psak halacha, of how to render halachic decisions, when you have a point of controversy between a majority versus a minority opinion, usually we would accept the majority opinion. And here you have Rabba Barchia behaving, we'll say, out of line, where he's practicing, or he's practicing a case, or he's ruling a case of chalitza in accordance with a shitas yochid. The Gemara now asks about, regarding Shmuel, my kashya, what's bothering Shmuel? Mok? If it's that Rabba Barchia allowed a mok to be the type of footwear removed from the brother's foot, stamo tanya, we have a stam teneg source that accepts a mok. So, and we know that a stam, an unnamed teneg source, is considered authoritative. So he has on what to base himself a rather authoritative source. Ilayla, if the fact that he did the chalitza at night, again, stam tanya, our Mishnah mentions it as being acceptable without any name attached to that opinion. We referred to him before as the Tanakama. So that's called a stam opinion. A stam, an unnamed opinion, is considered authoritative. So what was bothering Shmuel in Rabba Barchia's behavior? Elo yechidi kokashya lei. Heichi ovid biyechidi. The issue is that he did the chalitza by himself, and how can you accept a minority opinion and act thusly? The yechidah katoni law. How can you practice a case of chalitza? How can you oversee a case of chalitza by yourself when that is accepted only by a minority opinion, by an individual opinion? We'll see later that's Rabbi Akiva. Desnan Cholza b'shnayim or b'shlosha v'nimtza echad me'em krov pasul chalitza subsula. If the chalitza was done in the presence of 2 or in the presence of 3, but one of them was found to be unqualified because of his being either a relative or some other type of psul, of another disqualifying factor. Chalitza subsula. So using 2 people, or even 3, but one is found to be unqualified, the chalitza is unacceptable, is invalid. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yonasan Berger machshirim. These 2 opinions accept that situation. Umaisa be'echad shecholatz beinoi leveino beveso asurim was an incident where a man did chalitza with a woman in a prison. Ubo maisa lefnei Rabbi Akiva ve'hichshir. And Rabbi Akiva accepted that. So that if you see someone practicing chalitza without 3, that would be in accordance with Rabbi Akiva. But that's a shitas yochid, an individual authority. And that is what bothered Shmuel and gave rise to his sarcastic comment of Kama Rav Guvrei regarding Rabba Bar Chia, who did not require 3 people present. A second approach regarding this whole area is that all the points of Rabba Bar Chia were in accordance with individual opinions. Desanya, Omer Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi, Ani Roisi es Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha, Shecholatz b'mok b'yechidi b'layla. So that there is precedent for using a mok by yourself at night, but that's the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel ben Elisha, not a majority opinion, and hence that gave rise to Shmuel's being upset. B'smoil chalitzasa psula, and Rebbe Ozer was machshir. Removal of shoe from left foot, according to the Tanakama, is unacceptable. According to Rabbi Eliezer, it's okay. My time of the Rabbanon. Why do the Rabbanon rule stringently regarding left foot? Omar Ula Yalfinon regel mimetzora. Through a gezerah shava word comparison, we learn from mitzora, from the purification of the mitzora, when the mitzora who was in a state of defilement leaves that state, so there is a certain ritual that applies, and that involves the application of oil and blood of a sin of a guilt offering, an osham sacrifice, and it's done to his right foot, so that the exclusion of smoil of left foot in the case of chalitza is derived, according to the Rabbanan, who are strict, is derived from a word comparison, regel, whose origin is in mitzora. Ma lahalon diyamin, just like by the mitzora where we require the right part, the right appendage. Af kan, so to by chalitza diyamin, the right foot. The Gemara asks, for Rebbe Ozer lo yolef regel mitzora, does Rebbe Ozer, who is lenient, does he not learn a word comparison from mitzora v'atanya? We have a source, Rebbe Ozer Omer. Here is Rebbe Ozer featured in this Tanaic source. Minayin l'ritzia shehi ba'oizin haimonis. From where do we know that ritzia is the act whereby a Jewish slave wants to remain by his owner beyond the basic 6 years. So his ear is bored, and we say that, and that's called ritzia shehiba oizin hayimonis. How do you know that it's done in his right ear? Nemar kan oizin v'nemar lahalon oizin. You find in the case of the slave the word oizin. In the case of tsaras, you see the word oizin. Ma lahalon yamin, just like by mitzora, it's the right ear, it's the right earlobe on which the applications are made for the taras and mitzora. Af kan yamin. So too here by ritzia, it shall be the right, the right ear for the ritzia. So what do we see? We see Rebbe Ozer does learn word comparisons from mitzora. So then why is Rebbe Ozer accepting of chalitza b'smol when you have a regel word comparison from mitzora that would exclude the left side, like the left foot? Omar Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Omar Rav Yochanan, Muchlefes Hashita. What we have to do is we have to switch around the shitas, and by switching around, then things will become aligned. So that if you were to say you switch around the Tanakama with Rebbe Ozer then would tell you that the left side is unacceptable, because we learn from Mitzorah. And that once you switch around Rebbe Ozer holding by left as being restrictive, then that fits in with this source where Rebbe Ozer in fact learns other halachas from Mitzorah. A second approach, Rova Omar Li'olam Lo Tepuch. Don't switch shitas around. Oizen, mufni, regel, lo mufni. When it comes to the issue of the ear of the slave to be born and you have to determine which one it is, so that's mufni. Mufni means the words are available for making the gzera shava. Mufni, there are, in technically speaking, there are extra words that enable me to make this gzera shava. Regel, lo mufni. However, the words regel that you find by Mitzorah and that you find by the chalitza, so the words are not available. The Gemara asks, V'chi lo mufni, my pircha ika. Granted, they're not available for making the gzera shava, and according to the rules of gzera shava making, when the word is not extra or it's not free, so then we're entitled to raise questions in objecting to the gzera shava. So granted, regel is not free. And as a result of that, Rebbe Ozer, though he accepts the idea of comparing things to the Mitzorah, not in the case of the regel, and hence regel small will be kosher according to Rebbe Ozer. So as a result of it not being extra, you have questions to raise, and because of the questions, we're not going to make the gzera shava. The chilo mufni my pirchaiko, the Gemara says, granted it's not extra, the words aren't extra, they're needed for their immediate context. But what challenge could you raise anyway to the word comparison? So he says, Iko lemifrach, I have a challenge. I can undo the comparison as follows. Ma lemitzorah shekenton eitz erez v'ezo v'shni toloas. By the Mitzorah, I understand there's a restriction to the right foot because Mitzorah has extra requirements. The added requirements, in effect, could be considered extra restrictions, extra limitations. You can't do just whatever you want. By Mitzorah, you have to provide these other materials for his purification. The eitz erez, a type of wood. The azov is a type of a branch of some other type of growth. And shni tolas, a piece of wool that's dyed in this kind of dye. And we refer to that as the shni tolas. So because of that, by Mitzorah, you have the right being required. But in the case of chalitza, we don't have additional elements and factors that play a role. All you need is the shoe. So being that chalitza is not as encumbered with additional items, so the chalitza could very well be, as Rebbe Ozer says, be done bismoil, even though regarding other areas of halacha, Rebbe Ozer does learn gzera shavas from Mitzorah. Before we continue with the next Mishnah, on the side we have a topic heading where we've written the following: Chalitza, Rikika, and Kriya. These are Gimel Hamarkivim Shel Mitzvah Chalitza, 3 elements that make up the Chalitza process or Chalitza ritual. There's the shoe removal, there is spitting, and there is the recitation of verses from the Torah. Asa Shnayim Mehem Velo Hashlishis. If one were to do 2 and not all 3, Ha'im hi kshera o psula. Is it considered an effective chalitza or invalid? Now we said you did 2 out of the 3, but which 2? So the Mishnah goes through different combinations, different possibilities. Number 1, cholsa v'rokaka avolo kara. If the shoe was removed and spitting took place, but the required psukim were not recited, chalitza sekshera, the chalitza is acceptable. Kara v'rokika avolo cholza, if there was a citation of the psukim and there was spitting, but there was no shoe removal, chalitza subsula, that's an invalid chalitza. Number 3, cholza v'kara she removed the shoe from the brother-in-law's foot, and there was the necessary reading of the parsha of the psukim. Aval lo rokika. There was no spitting. Now, what about this? So here you have a machlokes. Rabbi Ozer Omer chalitzos psula. He says that it's ineffective. That spitting is an essential, an integral part of the chalitza ritual. And Rabbi Kiva Omer chalitzos kshera. That you can manage, so to speak, without the spitting. Of course, we're not telling you lechatchila to do away with it, but if that's what happened, so it's still acceptable. We continue at the top of Omid Beis. Omar lei Rebbe Ozer. Rebbe Ozer, who was insistent on the spitting, he says, Kocha ye'aseh. That's in the psukim that deal with the chalitza, and we learn from Kocha ye'aseh, Kol davar shu ma'aseh ma'akev. The word Kocha is a word indicating something restrictive, or a binding factor, so that from this we learn anything that is action related, as opposed to reading a psukim. The reading of something is not called an action, but spitting, for example, shoe removal as well, are actions. So all action matters are me'akev, as the word kocha expresses itself. Omerlei Rabbi Akiva, Misham Raya. Rabbi Akiva says, are bringing proof from there. Kocha ye'aseh lo'ish. Read the whole pasuk, read the three words together, and you have the following: Kol davar shu ma'aseh bo'ish. Anything that is an action that is done to the man, that is what is binding. So chalitza is a ma'aseh be'ish. The woman removes the shoe from his foot, that's from his body. So that's what is restrictive, that's what's binding. Kocha ye'aseh, don't miss the next word, lo'ish. So things that are done to the body, maisim in the body of the man, that's binding. Now that's in contrast to the spitting, which Rabbi Akiva said, if there's no spitting, the chalitza is kosher, because contrary to what some people might have as an image here, she doesn't spit into his face. The spit lands on the floor in front of him, but not touching him. So it's not a ma'aseh be'ish. The Mishnah goes on, Hacheresh shenechlatz v'hachereshes shecholza. A cheresh that's a deaf mute whose shoe is removed from him, and a chareshes, a deaf mute woman who does the chalitza. The chalitzes lekotten chalitza psula. The chalitza, the shoe removal from a surviving brother that happens to be a minor, that would be an unacceptable chalitza. Ketana shecholza tachlos mishetagdil. A girl who is a minor who did the chalitza, she should do it again when she becomes an adult. V'imlo cholza chalitzasa psula. And if she doesn't do so her chalitza is invalid. Cholza b'shnayim o b'shlosha v'nimsacha mikarav apostle. If a person did chalitza in the presence of two kosher dayanim, or in the presence of three, but one was later found to be unacceptable. He was either found to be a relative or someone who is in general unacceptable because of poor behavior. Chalitzasa psula. So according to the Tanakama here, chalitza done in front of two or in front of three, but one is found to be disqualified, that's an insufficient chalitza, it's an unacceptable chalitza. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yonasan Berger machshirin, they say it's okay. There was an incident where a brother-in-law and sister-in-law were in the penitentiary together, and he removed her shoe, and they were by themselves. This incident, this story came to the attention of Rabbi Akiva and said, it's okay. Before we continue with the Gemara, let us glance at the side where we have our Nosei Mivneh heading. Notice that we have triangles and Roman numerals 1 and 2. These represent Shnei Lishonos Shel Rava, two versions of Rava, B'inyan Ilaim V'ilemes Shecholzu. And Ilaim is a mute. They have the ability to hear, but they cannot speak. And they did chalitza. A volcano shape will appear, and that's Havlotas Havdeu Bein Shnei HaLishonos. We're attempting to highlight the distinction between the two versions. According to version 1, Kriya Lo Ma'akva, the recitation of the psukim are not a binding factor with regard to the validity or the validation of the chalitza. According to Lashon number 2, you will see that Kriya is Ma'akev. Now the Gemara. Omar Rava, Hashta di Amris, Kriya Lo Ma'akva. Now that you've said, and that is the case if you look at the first line of the Mishnah, that's the lower part of Omid Aleph, the Mishnah had opened up by saying, so we're in effect telling you that Kriya is not Ma'akev. The recitation of the psukim that are recited in the context of the Chalitza ceremony, if it's not done, so it's not a binding factor. Well, with that in mind, Lefikach, Ilaim V'ilem Shecholzu, Chalitza Son Kshera. If you have a mute man or woman that did chalitza, the chalitza is okay. That's Rava's conclusion. Tanan. Now we present a Tanaic source. Cheresh shenechlatz v'chareshes shecholza v'hachayletzis min hakoton chalitzasa psula. A cheresh is a deaf mute, and this, of course, we saw in the Mishnah itself, 4 lines from the top. A deaf mute that man or woman that are participatory in the chalitza, and chalitza from a minor where the brother-in-law is a minor, so that is an unacceptable chalitza. My timer. Why is it that if it's a deaf mute are participatory in the chalitza, is it no good? Lav mishum de lav b'nei kriya ninu. Isn't it because they are incapable of reading the psukim? So from here you see that the reading is a binding factor. Lo, that's not the problem of the cheresh and the chareshes. Rather, mishum de lav b'nei deya ninhu. It's because they lack awareness. They lack sufficient das. Das is knowledge or awareness of what's going on. Well, ihachi ilaim v'ilemes nami. Well, we should disqualify an ilaim and lemes as well. Omar Rava ilaim v'ilemes b'nei deya ninhu. They are different from the cheresh. The ilaim and ilemes are people of sound mind. Upumayu udekoyiv lahu. It's a figure of speech, but it translated means it's simply that their mouths hurt them. Their mouths are disabled. Their ability of speech has been disabled, but that does not reflect on their level of da'as, of knowledge, of awareness that's required for chalitza to be valid. The Gemara asks, "V'ho amri debei Rebbe Yanai, lefi she'eno be'omar v'omra." But in the yeshiva of Yanai, the cheresh and chareshes are disqualified as a result of their inability to say the psukim that the Torah expects of them. So, what about Rava? So you see that Rava's conclusion that Kriya is not Ma'akev is seemingly inaccurate. Elo ki itmar de Rava aseifa itmar. If Rava had said anything, his comment was on the seifa of the Mishnah. Cheresh shenechlatz v'cheresh shecholza v'chaletzes min hakoton chalitza psula. The very quote that we had before. Omar Rava hasha de amris kriya ma'akva. Notice the difference. Now that we have concluded that kriya is ma'akev. Lefikach ilaim v'ilemes shecholzu chalitza psula. Therefore, an ilaim or ilemes that do chalitza, their chalitza is invalid. They cannot read the psukim that are necessary. Umas nisin. What about our Mishnah? The opening of the Mishnah indicated that kriya is not ma'akev. Well, the understanding is as follows. Kerebi Zera. The Mishnah spoke about a chalitza ceremony where the shiur was removed, spitting took place, but the reading wasn't done. Still, the Mishnah says it's kosher, it's acceptable. Why? Based on Rabbi Zera's principle. Yomar Rabbi Zera, Kol haroi lebila ein bila ma'akeves boy, v'chol she'ein roi lebila bila ma'akeves. Before we attempt to translate that, let's express the principle of Rabbi Zera. The principle of Rabbi Zera is as follows: where something can be done in the potential, where it can be actualized, but for whatever reason it wasn't. But the potential is there for it to be actualized. So, if that's the case, you don't have to actually actualize it. You don't have to bring it to reality, because the reality or the possibility of whatever it is could be done. So if you have, let's say, two healthy people, the Yavam and the Yevama are two healthy people quite capable of speech, and they're of course of sound mind, they could read, but if they did the chalitza without the reading, it's kosher, it's acceptable. Why? Because in potential they could have read. However, if you have a situation where the potential cannot be realized, so then that element that is necessary becomes a binding factor. And therefore, the case of the Ilaim and Ilemis, since they can't in potential read, the reading now becomes a binding factor, and since the reading doesn't take place, the chalitza is posel, is invalid. Rabbi Zera himself was referring to a specific case that deals with the halachas of meal offerings. Truth is I would prefer not to get too sidetracked, but in respect to the translation, kol haroi lebila, a meal offering is made of flour, and many meal offerings have oil that accompany them, and there is a minimum amount of flour that's required for meal offerings, but in many cases you can increase the amount of flour that you bring, but you are maintaining the same initial amount of oil. What is important is that if you mix the flour with the oil, all of the flour would come into contact with some of the oil. If, however, you have more than the maximum amount of flour, so much so that the amount of oil that is mandated for a mincha would be too little to come into contact with all of that flour. So a situation like that would be an unacceptable mincha. The ratio is too great between the oil and the flour. So what Rabbi Zera says is as follows: if you have a mincha that in potential, it's roi lebila, the potential for mixing it and having a uniform distribution of the oil coming into contact with all of the flour, then ein bilo ma'akeves. You don't have to actually mix it together. However, v'chol she'ein roi lebila, if the amount of flour is too great, is too much for with respect to the mandated amount of oil, and if you were to mix it, some parts of it would remain dry because of the great quantity of flour that's there. So then we say bilo ma'akeves, the need for mixing it becomes a binding factor, and since it won't mix evenly, it will be unacceptable. That is by way of background for his principle, but in our case, the principle itself is, as we said, if an action or an element is possible in theory, then you don't have to actualize it. But if it's not possible in theory, then that element becomes a binding factor. We continue with a new marking, and on the side of the under the nosei mivneh heading, you'll notice a bow tie, and there's also letters Aleph and Beis. These are Shnei Lishonos be'inyan Yevamos sherokika b'fnei Beis-din l'fnei chalitzas hanal. A Yevama that spits in court before the shoe is removed. The proper order is first the shoe is removed, and then the spitting takes place. But she spit first in the court before their shoe removal. So, Aleph, nifsala la'achin. That will result in her inability to marry any of the brothers. So even though the shoe wasn't removed, the spitting cancels her ability to go ahead with a marriage to one of the brothers. We're not saying that enables her to marry someone else, someone from the shuk, to be matir her to the public, but it does accomplish this much, that she's now unfit to marry one of the brothers. The second lashon will tell us that spitting that was done out of order is einot sricha loruk pam nosefet. She doesn't have to spit a second time. So that according to that, she spit before the shoe removal, then removes the shoe and doesn't spit again. Now we turn to the Gemara. Sholchu le avua d'Shmuel. It was sent to avua Shmuel. Yevama sherokika. A Yevama, the widow that spit in front of the court, in the context of a chalitza ceremony, tachlotz. She has to go through with the shoe removal. Rashi explains, she has become posel to do yibum. So once she spit, she now has to go ahead with the shoe removal. Michlal, the ifsala law me'achin. From this we infer that the spitting causes her to become disqualified from marrying any of the surviving brothers. Moni, who would be the author of this idea? Now you can see the double underline appears. These are stages in trying to figure out who is the author of this idea. In Lemo, Rabbi Akiva, Hashta, Uma b'mokim mitzvah, De'ika l'meimar, Midi dahavi a'imurim. Mokom mitzvah is a reference to the time of chalitza. At the time of chalitza, where Rekika is a mitzvah. And there is reason, or there is logic to compare this situation where you have two elements. You have a shoe removal and you have a spitting. And there's another area of halacha where we have two elements. And that's the issue of emurim. Emurim are the innards of a sacrifice. In order for a sacrifice to be acceptable, you have to, and able to eat the meat, you have to sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice, and the innards have to be offered on the Mizbeach. However, with regard to the innards, the standard is different than the standard with regard to the blood. The blood, if it's not sprinkled, or let's say the blood gets lost, then everything stops there. The sacrifice is invalid. With regard to the innards, the following is the case. Dechilesnehu lo ma'akvi. If they're not around, if they got lost, so they're not binding, the meat can be eaten, the sacrificial meat can be eaten, as long as the blood was sprinkled. V'chi isnehu ma'akvi. But when they are around, when the innards of a sacrifice are around, you must offer them before you can eat the meat. And even so, Omar Rabbi Akiva lo ma'akva. Again, this is a reference back to the spitting by the Yevamos. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that the spitting is not a binding factor. Me'achin ifsala. Would you say, according to Rabbi Akiva, that the spitting that she does do would render her unfit? In the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, the spitting is a very minor element, so that where you see, let's say, in contrast to the issue of the sacrifice and the emurim, where in the case of the emurim, if something is there, it's binding. Namely, if the emurim are there, it's binding upon the eating of the sacrificial meat. The spitting is not me'akev, it's not binding. So, how in the world would Rabbi Akiva ever be the one to say that the spitting, if done, would render her unfit to the brothers? Let's take a look at the Rashi. A'imurim, dechi isnu ma'akvi bosu me'achila, perak tomid nishchat, it's in Maseches Psachim. It is taught that if the emurim, the innards of the sacrifice, are present, the innards are those organs or sections of an animal that are put onto the fire of the altar, those portions of the sacrifice of the animal that are put on the altar. V'chilesnehu lo ma'akvi. If they're not around, they're not a binding factor. Gon shenitmu o she'avdu, they became defiled or they got lost. V'hachanami nemo afagav delav maise choshuv beish, who, even though it's not considered a maise beish, as we saw earlier, hoyo v'efsher loruk la'akev, since it's something that is possible to be done. In other words, what Rashi is saying is that according to the standard that says, if it's not a maisa in the man, like the shoe, you're removing the shoe from his foot, that's the maisa beish, that's what's binding. But if it's something like spitting, it's not a maisa beish, and therefore it's not binding. However, if it's around, it should be binding, we said, like be'emurim. V'kom Rabbi Akiva lo makfa, and Rabbi Akiva says, even though the spitting, she's there, she could spit. Well, according to Rabbi Akiva, if she doesn't, it's not binding. So that in the eyes of Rabbi Akiva, the spitting is on a very low level of significance, and as a result of that, let's put it this way, it's on a lower level of significance in the context of Yibum, more so than it's a lower level than emurim are in the context of sacrifices. So how can Rabbi Akiva be the one to say that if she does spit, it would have the effect of rendering her unfit to do Yibum with the brothers? So that which was sent to Avu de Shmuel, that Yevamos Shirakaka has to do chalitza because she's rendered unfit to continue with Yibum, that can't be Rabbi Akiva's opinion. V'yelo l'Rebbe Elazar. Rabbi Ozer, he said in the Mishnah that the Rikika is a binding factor. The Gemara continues, V'ha shnei dvarim hamatirin ninhu Ushnei dvorim hamatirin ein ma'alin ze below ze. This is a principle that you find in other areas of sacrifices. Two elements that are needed to enable something to become mutter. And if one is there without the other, ein ma'alin ze below ze. There, one is ineffective without the other. So therefore, Rakika alone, spitting alone, couldn't render her unfit to do Yibum. Elo Kerebi, that which was sent to Avu Dishmuel, that a Yevamos who spits in the presence of Beis Din renders her unfit. It has a consequence. It renders her unfit to Yibum. This would be in accordance with Rebbe, the Sanya. We have a Tanaic source that deals with a sheep offering that's offered on the holiday of Shavuos. They're called Kivsei Atzeres. As a result of the offering of the Kivsei Atzeres, the Shtei Halechem, another offering that accompanies them, 2 loaves. The 2 loaves that are brought on Shavuos, along with the Kivsei Atzeres, they will become sanctified. So that's by way of general background. Now, what does the source say? And of course, we're going to be interested in seeing Shitas Rebbe, the opinion of Rebbe, as we go on. Kivsei Atzeres ein mikachim halechem elo b'shchita. The Kivsei Atzeres are not able to sanctify the bread. To sanctify the bread means that the bread would then be elevated to something we call Kedushas Haguf. It's an inherent level of sanctity which, when present, the item can no longer be redeemed, where the holiness is transferred onto money. So the Kivsei Atzeres do not elevate the lechem, the shtei lechem, the 2 loaves, to this level of Kedushas Haguf, other than through their slaughtering. Ketzad? So, shachton lishmon v'zorak domon lishmon. If the slaughtering was done with proper intention and the sprinkling of the blood was done with proper intention, kidei shalechem, then the lechem becomes sanctified. Shochat shelo lishmon v'zorak lishmon. If the shchita was done with an improper intention, but the sprinkling of the blood was done with proper intention, lo kidei shalechem. The bread is not sanctified. Shachton lishmon v'zorak domon shelo lishmon, where the slaughtering was done properly. The zrikas adam, the sprinkling of blood, was done with an improper mindset. Kadosh v'eino kadosh, divrei Rebbe. Kadosh v'eino kadosh means there's some level of sanctification, but not complete. That's Rebbe's opinion. What do we see from here? We see that true sanctity of Kedushas Haguf is achieved when both elements are done properly. Where just one was done properly, and here we're focusing on the Shlita was done properly, the Shlita alone has an effect. So too the Rakika alone has an effect to render her possible to marry the brothers, to render her to disqualify her from continuing with Yibum with them. Rabbi Ozer b'Shimon Omer lo meino kadosh ad sheyishchot lishmon v'yizrok domon lishmon. No sanctity is achieved until both are done with proper intention. So, with that in mind, you can see that the statement that was told to Avu Dishmuel would be based on the thinking of Rebbe. Now we turn our attention back to Rebbe Akiva. We have a little arrow here, if you want to align this with the arrow above. Above we have a line where Rebbe Akiva said that the Rakika could not possibly result in her being puzzle to the brothers. And now we ask, now this question lasts a number of lines. Ula Rebbe Akiva, Rakika lo pasla, and according to Rebbe Akiva, is that really so that spitting does not render her unfit to continue with Yibum. On the side, we have a nosei mivneh, a topic heading with a structural note. Diamonds will appear. Nasa rak pu'ulo achas mitoch hashlosha. In the Mishnah, by the way, we saw where 2 of the 3 actions had been done. Here, we're going to mention where one of the chalitza activities were done. One of the 3. Diun b'shitas Rabbi Akiva legabi Yevamos sherokika bilvad. We're going to be focusing on what does Rabbi Akiva have to say about a Yevama that does the spitting alone, just the spitting. So now, is it so then, as we suggested before, that according to Rabbi Akiva, Rekika would not render her unfit? V'hatanya. We have the following source. The diamonds, as we said, highlight the one activity that was done. Cholza, shoe removal took place. Veloi rokika velo kora. No spitting, no reading of psukim. Chalitza shera. That's an effective chalitza. It's effective. Rokika velo cholza velo kora. Chalitza psula. Spitting took place, but not shoe removal nor reading of psukim. That's an invalid chalitza. Kora v'lo rokika v'lo cholza ein kan beis michush. If there was only reading and no spitting, no shoe removal, then there's nothing to even suspect. It's like nothing happened. And as a result of that, Rashi adds, she could even do yibum. Money. Who would be the author of this source? And again, you can see the double underlining we're using in order to highlight the stages of analysis. Ilema Rabbi Eliezer. If you were to associate this source with Rabbi Eliezer, well, how could it be? It said in this source, Cholza, v'lo rokika v'lo kora chalitza kshera. Shoe removal took place, but no spitting and no reading. That's it's kosher. V'ha'amar Rabbi Eliezer, kocha ye'aseh, kol davar shumaisim akev. Rabbi Eliezer said that anything that's action related, as opposed to the reading, which is not called an action, anything that's action related, which includes spitting, is me'akev. So that can't, the source that said cholza without rokika could not be authored by Rabbi Eliezer. Elapshita Rabbi Akiva. Vikotani. So we have a source above that we're going to ascribe to Rabbi Akiva. Vikotani, it said here, Rokika v'lo cholza v'lo kora chalitza psula. She spit, but there was no shoe removal nor reading. It's called an invalid chalitza. Psula. Leman. She is called unfit. Unfit to whom? If the source is trying to tell me that she is unfit to marry is into the public, she's free to marry, pshita. Mihavya chalitza dishtar be'alma. That's obvious. There wasn't any shoe removal. The shoe removal is the element that will release her from the bond and enable her to marry. That didn't take place. It said lo cholza. So when you say she's psula, she's disqualified. Disqualified from what? From marrying into the public? That's obvious. Elolav la'achin. Psula means she's disqualified to the brothers. Shma Mina. So this shows us, according to Rabbi Akiva, that if you have Rokika alone, she is rendered unfit to the brothers. So that you'd have to, at this point, take stock of the Gemara before, where we seem to reject out of hand the statement made Tavu Dishma that Rokika would render her unfit, where the Gemara before had said it couldn't be Rabbi Akiva. Here we're saying that in fact it could be like Rabbi Akiva. The Gemara continues with a question: Rabbi Akiva, Maishna Rekika or Maishna Kriya? What is the difference between Rekika, which has the effect of rendering her unfit, as opposed to Kriya, which in that same source which we're ascribing to Rabbi Akiva, says Ein Kan Beis Miklush means nothing whatsoever was accomplished, and she's kosher, she's acceptable even to do Yibum, where it doesn't passel her. The Gemara answers, Kriya de Isa bein betchila bein besof. The reading of psukim takes place at the beginning of the ceremony and at the end of the ceremony. Loi michlefa lei. One would not come to any confusion. We're going to explain this a little bit later, and let's finish just another phrase or two, and then we'll look at the Rashi. So Kriya is different than Rekika. Kriya is done at the beginning and at the end. So as a result of that, we won't reach a point of confusion and mistake. Rekika, however, when it comes to spitting, the betchila lesa ulebesof isa, Rekika is done only at the end. It's not done at the beginning. Michlefa lei v'asu lemishri chalutza la'achin. If it could result in confusion, and we could end up being matir a woman that did chalitza to the brothers, which of course is a major avera, a major sin. If we, with regard to Rekika, if we would allow her after she did Rekika, and if we were to say that she's not pasul liachin, if we were to say she can marry one of the brothers, people will think that the Rekika, everyone knows Rekika is done after the shoe removal. So if they see a situation of a woman who did an act of spitting, they automatically calculate in their minds, this followed the shoe removal. And if we allow her to marry one of the brothers, people will think that a woman who did chalitza could marry a brother, can still do yibum. And that, of course, is terribly wrong. With regard to Kriya, though, people aren't going to come to that conclusion. If people hear just Kriya, and they see her then marrying a brother, the brother-in-law, people will say, well, it's because the Kriya that was done was only the Kriya at the beginning. She didn't reach the shoe removal stage yet. So that allowing a woman after Kriya, or having done Kriya alone, and allowing her to marry a brother-in-law, her deceased husband's surviving brother, is not going to lead to people concluding that a chalutza, a woman who did the shoe removal, can marry, because people will think that the reading that took place was the initial reading. With regard to Rekika, there is no initial Rekika. The only Rekika that takes place is the Rekika that's done after the shoe removal. So if people see a spitting that takes place, and as was suggested, maybe she should be mutter to the brothers, that would lead to a major mistake on the part of the public, because people associate the spitting with the shoe removal having taken place. And if they see a woman who did the act of spitting then going ahead and marrying one of the surviving brothers, people will think that even after shoe removal, a woman is still eligible to do yibum, which, as we said before, is a major mistake. Ve'ika the Amri Hachi Sholchulei. Another version has the following that was sent to Avu Shmuel: Yevamos Shirokika Tachloitz V'Eino Tzricha Loruk Pam Acheres. A Yevama that did the spitting before the shoe removal, we tell her, remove the shoe, and you don't have to do another spitting. Kihahi, even though the proper order of things is to have the spitting done after the shoe removal, but we don't tell her to do that. Kihahi Yevama Dasya Lekamei de Rebbe Ami. There was an incident where a Yevama had come to Rebbe Ami. Havi Yosef Rebbe Abba Bar Momo Kamei, and Rebbe Abba was present there, sitting in front of him. Rokaka Makami de Tachlutz, and she spat before the shoe removal. Omar lei Rabbi Ami. Rabbi Ami said, Chalotz law, V'shori law tigra. Have the shoe removal, and then that will settle the issue. Shori law tigra means settle the argument, but Rashi says, Potur v'shalchena mi bezdin. That will be sufficient, that she removes the shoe and then send her out, she's free. Amar le Rabbi Abba v'ha bo'inon merak. But isn't there a spitting requirement? So Rabbi Ami answers, Ha rokika law. Well, but she already spit. She spit beforehand. So he asks back, V'terukum abakach. Let her spit again. What's the big deal? What do you lose by her spitting again? Nafik minei churba. If she spits again, you're creating a possible, let's say, major error, something destructive. What do we mean by that? Te'i amris tehader v'teruk. If you insist on her doing the rekika again, amri, people will think, Rekika kamaisa les bo mashasha the osi lemishri chalutza la'achin. People will think that the initial chalitza, the initial rekika, that is the initial spitting, had no significance whatsoever. Meaning, no significance, and she's not even rendered unfit to the brothers, to her brother-in-law. And if she would then go and do yibum, at the end of the day, people will think that a chalutza is mutter to brothers, to marry a brother-in-law. So it's important, says Rabbi Ami, that once Rekika was done, that's it. Don't have it done again. Because as we said, if it's done again, people will think that the first Rekika had no impact whatsoever, and as we explained before, people associate in general rekika with that which took place after the shoe was removed. And if people see her doing a second rekika and then creating in their minds that the first rekika was a zero, people will think that rekika, when done in isolation, has no significance. And as we said before, that the mistake that will arise in people's minds will occur. Let's take a look at Rashi a few lines up from here. Amri, people will say, Rekiko kamaisa les bo mashosh. If we ask her to do a second Rekiko, people will say that the initial Rekika had no substance to it, no halachic substance or halachic application. Velo posla me'achin. And she's not unfit even to the brothers. Uman dechozi de misyabma, and people who would see her doing yibum, sovar rekika bozer chalitza havoy. That this was a rekika after the shoe removal, kiurche, which is the normal order of events. V'sharinon chalutza la'achin, and in effect, people would think that a woman who did chalitza is still muteres to do yibum. So just to go over this last point, the point of Rabbi Ami, once rekika is done, we don't want to have it done again. Even though it's out of order, we don't want to have it done again, because people will then conclude that the first rekika is of no significance, and then, a woman like that could go and do yibum. And then people who see that will say that, rekika, that's generally something that happened after the shoe was removed, and this woman was marrying her brother-in-law. It must be that people, chalutzas, are allowed to do yibum, which of course is a major mistake. The Gemara asks, V'ha bo'inon kisidron, is there not a necessity of having things done in proper order? Namely, first chalitza and then the spitting? The Gemara says, Kisidron lo ma'akfa. The issue of things done in order is not a binding factor. Who savar dechuye komadchile? Rabbi Abba thought that Rabbi Ami was just giving him a push-off answer, not a real answer. Nofak dog v'ashkach. He went out and looked into things carefully and found Desanyo bein shehiktim chalitza l'rekika bein shehiktim rekika l'chalitza masha'asa asui. Whether chalitza is done before rekika or the rekika is done before the chalitza, namely out of order. What is done is done. In other words, it's sufficient. It's your yotze that way. Namely, the order is not ma'akev.